Today, we're going to take a look at how some of the best players in the world deviate from what we're calling the optimal play here at GTO Wizard, as we look at this hand between Bryn Kenny and Adrian Mateos in the 250k Super High Roller. Make sure to let us know in the comments after the video which of these world-class players you think made the best deviation from optimal play. We are heads up in the 250k Super High Roller at the WSOP, and it's Bryn Kenny raising the button to 1.3 million against Adrian Mateos in the big blind. He defends 5-3 offsuit, Kenny with the pocket eights, headed to a flop with just over 6 big blinds in the middle. For those of you who have been watching the WSOP coverage and noticing the optimal play, you might have recognized that pre-flop play is not evaluated by GTO Wizard during these segments. That's because in order to deliver quick enough solutions for a live broadcast, we need to use a separate prediction engine to figure out the pre-flop ranges that apply to this spot. Once we get through pre-flop play, everything from the flop onwards is solved in real time using the sizes that players actually use in-game. Now, to start our analysis of this hand, I want to play this as Bryn Kenny. I want to look at what makes Bryn so elite and also why he's making plays that differentiate from optimal play. On the flop, he chooses to check behind as we would have recommended 85% of the time according to the live solution. And when he gets checked to again on the turn, you can see the recommendation from GTO Wizard is to bet large 75% of the time. A quick note is that large bets are classified as anything between 67 and 100% of the pot. Now what Bryn actually goes for here is a bet of 4 million. This is a slight overbet of the pot and larger than what the engine recommended in this situation. Now it's my opinion that the reason Bryn does this is because he believes most opponents in the big blind will lead out with too strong of a range. They're going to get to this situation relatively capped, and he thinks he can go really big even for thin value. Now Mateos with a straight is just check calling on the turn and continues to play this hand passively. Now at this point, Bryn has put in a lot of money for the strength of pocket eights, and GTO Wizard recommends that he check behind 100% of the time. But Bryn continues to believe that not only are most opponents in the other seat capped, but he also believes that he has the image of someone who's aggressive enough and willing to attack cap ranges enough that he can get paid for a really large bet here, even with thin value. What he ends up putting in is about 120% of the pot, a massive bet for the strength of his hand. Now Mateos has the straight. He's obviously not going anywhere. The question is just whether he will call or move all in. Later in the video, when we look at the hand from Adrian's point of view, I'll get deeper into this one, but all you need to know for now is that Adrian makes the call on the end, and Kenny loses a huge pot here, swinging the momentum in Adrian's favor. Now, I want to take a look in GTO Wizard to see how Bryn Kenny deviated and what assumptions would need to be true in order for that to be better than the optimal play. First, let's note the pre-flop strategy that's being assumed here. We saw Bryn open to 1.3 million on the button, and we don't know if he's planning on mixing limps or just raising on the button, but I am under the assumption that our pre-flop solution going into the live solving was assuming that the play Bryn made is the play he would make with his whole range. So that's why I started here with a raised 2.6 big blinds and no limping on the button. The next detail to be aware of is that on the flop, we are using dynamic bet sizing to choose the best options for Bryn. And I assumed that we're using 2 bet sizes plus the option to check behind, so 3 options on the flop. As I understand it, this is the limit that they're going for on live broadcast to keep the graphics simple and easy to interpret. Now, as you can see, the exact combo that Bryn had, 8 of spades, 8 of clubs, is primarily checking behind. This isn't the exact frequency that was suggested in the broadcast, but I think we're on the right track for recreating the solution. Now, Bryn doesn't see any reason to deviate on the flop here, and I have to agree with his approach. This hand is over 60 big blinds deep. You've got a 9-high board where your opponent will check raise very aggressively, and pocket eights doesn't accomplish a lot by betting big on the flop. If Bryn wants to bet big with his overall strategy, as I suspect he does, then pocket eights is a pretty clear check behind to keep the pot manageable. Now the turn is where Bryn starts to make big assumptions. I'm going to look at the big blind strategy first, because I believe when Bryn overbets pocket eights, what he's claiming is that Adrian is not going to check a strong enough range to him. So how strong is the range that Adrian's supposed to check on the turn? If we look just at nutted hands from the top of his range, straights are checking less than a third of the time. Sets don't exist in this line, but two pair and top pair hands are also pretty rarely checking. If I look at the overall checking range composition, only about 8% of the range is better than top pair, and top pair is only 1%. So a pretty small percentage of the overall range is nutted here. Now, interestingly enough, when I edit the small blind strategy to the size that Bryn used, when I go with 8 big blinds as the only size, pocket eights is still a pure bet. So it does add up, at least to this point in the hand, that Bryn is choosing a bigger bet size, but his play is still GTO approved. Now, I think this is the key point in the hand where Bryn's strategy doesn't match up well against Adrian. First, a key component of playing this spot well against what Bryn is doing is to make big folds right now on the turn. If I look at third pair and low pairs, these hands are primarily folding. Over 60% of the time, you're supposed to fold with 6x and 4x to a single bet. A lot of players are not just check folding pairs and heads up to one bet. Another important piece is what the top of range is doing. Now, Adrian is meant to be quite aggressive with straights and two pair, even facing this large bet size, raising almost half the time. Now, we'll never know what he would have done with other hands in this range, but we do know that he check called 5-3 on this occasion, and we can see that in the solver, it is never supposed to check call. Fast forwarding to the river after Adrian check calls, and Bryn now goes for the overbet again. 29 big blinds, 130% pot was his river bet. When I look specifically at his combo choosing to make this bet, it's over a 5 big blind mistake compared to checking. It's important to look at the EV difference of plays like this when you're studying so that you can gauge, well, how correct do I need to be? How big of an assumption do I need to be right about in order to overcome this theoretical loss? The real problem is on the river facing this bet size. Not only can Adrian have a better hand, but he just doesn't really need to call the river with worse hands. If I look just at third pair, second pair, top pair, and ace high, these hands are folding almost 80% of the time. Top pair only needs to defend about half the time, and top pair is usually not in this spot. Now, part of this is thanks to the traps that Adrian might get to the river with, but also he could have just improved to trips, right? Any 4 with a draw is going to check call the turn, so he could have made trips on the river too. So what exactly needs to be true in order for Bryn's bet to be better than the optimal play? I want to go back to that key point on the turn before Adrian checked with his straight. And I want to make some assumptions about how other players might approach the turn spot. I'm going to go into the node locking interface and look at hand classes. At this point, it doesn't matter so much exactly what strategy I choose, just that I want to make sure to remove certain hands from the checking range. So I'm sliding this over to 0% check, and I'm just going to start removing hands like top pair. Now, I don't think that Bryn expects top pair to check the turn, and I don't think that Bryn expects two pair to check call the turn. Now, I can just fix that problem here by not letting it check in the first place, because I'm only interested in the strategy once we get check two. We already know that pocket eights was allowed to bet on the turn, but I just want to start filtering out some hands that might beat us on the river. Furthermore, I'm going to assume that straights don't go in the check call line either. So the only hands that go in the check call line, at least from the turn, are hands that pocket eights is ahead of. So I've removed all hands that could beat pocket eights on the turn. We went check call and the river came 4 of diamonds. Now, pocket eights is still looking to check behind, but look at the EV differences. We're looking at a much, much closer decision now that we've removed top pair, two pair, and straights from the check calling range on the turn. Now that said, it would still be a mistake, and if I add back in that 29 big blind bet size, it's going to be a very large mistake to choose this with pocket eights. You can see about a 2.5 big blind EV loss between betting this size and checking behind. So is there anything else here that we might be assuming in order to justify this play? One piece for me is that the 4 paired on the river and Adrian could have led. So there might be certain hands that decide to lead this river, for example, the 4x that improves. Naturally, the other thing to take into account is just going back to that turn calling range. Bryn might think that with his image, he gets paid more often by a 6 without a draw, by a 4 without a draw, and that's going to improve his ability to get called on the river. As it stands, once he gets to the river, big blind's range is 30% trips. So there's just a massive amount of the overall range that can beat pocket eights, given how much folding happened on the turn. For that reason, once you're allowed to fold your 56% or whatever it is on the river, you end up where over half of the calling range is trips. Obviously, this is a disaster for a thin value bet. Now, if I look at the raw equity of pocket eights before anything happens, you can see it's 74%. So yes, if Adrian just called his whole range on the river, you would have a winning value bet with pocket eights. But we can't overlook what happened in the real hand. Adrian had a straight and chose to check call the turn, which was a big deviation from optimal play. Maybe we should take a look at this from his point of view. Going back through the decisions as Adrian now, we're facing 2.6x on the button. We're very deep. 5-3 offsuit is a clear defend in the big blind with big blind ante. I don't see any reason to 3-bet. On the flop, it's going to check through, so no decision necessary. And on the 7 of clubs, now probing is on our mind. I think that with a straight, what Adrian's debating is how aggressive is my opponent going to be when I check to him, and can I use this hand as a turn check raise instead of probing myself? Because I think if Adrian probes, let's say 2/3 pot, he doesn't expect to get raised very often. This looks like a very strong board for him. But now he checks and he faces a bigger bet than he was bargaining for. And, you know, I listened to Adrian's winner's interview after this tournament, and he did say in recapping this hand that he was surprised by the bet size and thought that it was quite polar. So understandably, Adrian was expecting fewer hands like pocket eights and more hands like 2-pair, maybe a straight, and there are better straights possible. So it's interesting to just go check call if you're up against a very polar range. Adrian might have been playing 0% check raise here on the turn. And this shows a bit of how Adrian thinks about building a strategy. I think Bryn's entire plan here was, I'm going to make the most possible out of pocket eights in this spot, given my assumptions. Now, Adrian's kind of updating on the fly. He's thinking, oh, I'm up against a new strategy that I didn't consider I might be up against. Well, let me build a new strategy to counter that, right? I think Adrian is looking at this very macro, not being greedy with his 5-3, but just thinking, if I'm up against a very polar betting range that I wasn't expecting, maybe I'll never check raise the turn, and this is how I'm going to adapt on the fly. Now, as it stands, he was recommended to go all in, even in spite of these overbets, and I think this is just where GTO assumptions conflict with Adrian's real human assumptions. So let's take a look at what would have been necessary in Bryn's strategy to make him willing to play this more aggressively instead of just going for the check call. I'm going to skip straight to the turn decision, as we know that 5-3 was played somewhat standard up to that point. And as we saw on the live broadcast, 5-3 just can do whatever it wants here on the turn. It could bet small, it could bet big, it could check. And I do suspect that Adrian was mixing these options. We don't know just because he checked that his plan is to always check with 5-3. Certainly he understands the benefits of probing and getting called by one pair, and he also certainly understands the benefits of checking and trying to check raise. If Adrian decided to bet small on the turn, he would need to hope that Bryn is going to raise and raise big pretty often. So it's possible that he ruled this out as subpar in practice. Not many people play this aggressively against a small probe. Even against a larger probe, Bryn in position is supposed to raise 15% of the time. So maybe the best way to get chips in is to check and try to check raise. It's unclear to me what Adrian felt was the best play against Bryn specifically, but I do think that against a lot of competition in heads up, when you check, they tend to over-aggress. 58% checking is more than it feels like, and I think a lot of players would be a little bit too aggressive in position against check. So personally, I like the choice to check and try to check raise on the turn. Now, if Adrian had gotten the option that he was expecting, I believe he would have check raised. If he faced 2/3 pot, he would easily have seen the possibility of 7x, 6x, slow played top pair, pocket eights, of course, all these hands, and 5-3 would be a relatively straightforward check raise. Although you can see that the EV of check calling is still not worse. Now, once we update Bryn's strategy to 8 big blinds, just how polar is he supposed to be? I mean, we can see that pocket eights was already betting, and there's a great deal of top pair and even second pair in this betting range, but it's all a frequency play. Interestingly enough, 2-pair and sets are playing very passively when we choose this bet size. It seems to me like this is an inefficient bet when we block so much of the board, because trying to get called just by 1 pair is a lot harder when you have 2-pair or a set. Perhaps we're worried that we're running into straights too often once we bet this big and we block the board. You can see that while a straight is only 4% of the overall range getting here in Mateos's spot, He's folding 2/3 of the time, so it's a pretty significant percentage of the continuing range. And then add in the fact that bluffs can also check raise you, and I do start to understand why opening the action with anything thin for this size is not the most attractive option. Again, all of this only works because Adrian was willing to mix in some strong checks on the turn in the first place. If you're not mixing in any checks on the turn, then you're opening yourself up to the exploit that Bryn was trying here. Now, once Adrian calls this big bet, he is meant to have some leads on the board pairing river. It makes sense. He's going to have some marginal draws in his range that just check call on the turn. He'll arrive here with king 8 high, for example. And he has so many 2-pair, 3 of a kind in his range that he's able to lead some of those hands and allow some bluffs. This is an overall good river spot for him, and once he checks, this 29 big blind river bet is really meant to be trips or better. Because there's meant to be so much folding from Adrian on the turn, and he improves to trips so often on the river, it's very hard for Bryn to value bet in position with less than trips. Now, one interesting note that I want to point to is that I assumed when I was building this solution that other bet sizes were possible. But of course, as we know in the broadcast, we're solving according to the bet size that was actually taken. So if I simplify everything to betting 29 on the river instead of being able to also go all in, then we're going to see different responses. If I look first at the response to this 29 big blind bet, with the few percent of 5-3 that I've node locked to enter in here, you can see that it's a pretty clear all in, and you're making almost 10 big blinds more by shoving than you are by calling. The range that bets 29 is predominantly trips and bluffs, and there's very few hands that can beat 5-3 in this range. Now, interestingly, if I remove all in and the other bet sizes and force 29 as the only river bet size for Bryn, well, now you're looking at a spot where 8-5 and 10-8, as Adrian pointed to in his analysis of playing this hand afterwards, that he thought were a real concern in game. Now, if this is Bryn's only size and he's not splitting to sometimes go all in and sometimes bet 29 big blinds, which honestly feels pretty realistic to me, it's hard to believe that you also have an all-in size when you're already overbetting for 60% of your stack. Now, if we look at the response to that play, you can actually see that 5-3 is a better call by about 2 big blinds compared to going all in. It's too thin to go for value because of how often 8-5 and 10-8 are in this range. So it's interesting to me, you can see the set of assumptions that Adrian was applying completely different from the set of assumptions that Bryn was applying, but both players with reasonable justification for the deviations they made. Now, to me, this looks like a realistic case where Bryn might have had too many stronger hands than 5-3, and just calling with 5-3 on the end was not that big of a mistake. Additionally, you can see that the turn call that Adrian made, which was a deviation, was a pretty profitable one. I mean, he got a hand in pocket eights that was never, ever supposed to bet the river to bet, or at least Bryn chose to bet that hand. I don't know if you can say Adrian got him to do it, but regardless, Adrian's deviation worked out brilliantly in this case, and it did eventually lead to him picking up the title and winning the 250K for the second time at the World Series of Poker. It seems like, at least for this hand, Adrian's balanced, range-minded adjustments to the optimal play outmatched Bryn's hand-focused, greedy overbetting for value with pocket eights. But once again, let me know in the comments what you think of these two players and how they choose to deviate from optimal play. This has been Kevin Rabichow for GTOWizard.com. Thanks for watching.